conversation, which I hope will be very fruitful for all of us, for all of participants, for all of the audience, for different world region, wanting to understand how important US elections are for us, for our countries, for our regions, and for the whole system of international relations. I am honored to have such distinguished and esteemed speaker with me today. We'll start from Canada to Pakistan due to the time zone concerns, and I guess is it. So our discussion will be built in the following way. First of all, each speaker is asked to say how the elections, we still don't know who would be the president because there are no like official results. We may suppose something, so I suggest that we may do it the both way, either Donald Trump, either Joe Biden. So how would it would influence your home region? And then after each speaker is done, we'll make a short statement, each of us, about how the election would influence the whole world architecture. So I ask you to speak in a timely manner. So now you will have the floor from 7 to 10 minutes in order not to cross the lines of our time schedule and maybe to have some time left for the Q&A. So like our technical staff has also edited in the chat the link for the Facebook watch of our event, and the YouTube watch will be available as well. So you are asked to share this link with anybody interested in our discussion. So I guess is it, and we'll start. Yes, as I mentioned, we'll start with Canada, with our early morning Canada, and I'm thrilled to welcome Andrew Rasilius, fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. It's my honor to have you today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and greetings from Canada this morning. So let me start by saying that for Canada, living right beside the United States, we have a very particular relationship. And what happens south of the border is critical for Canada. The earlier Prime Minister, Pierre-Elliott Trudeau, the father, once said that for Canada, Canada is like a mouse living beside the elephant. So the mouse really knows what the elephant is doing. Sometimes the elephant doesn't know what the mouse is doing. Or if the United States sneezes, Canada catches a cold. So the experience of the elections right now, Canadians, the majority of Canadians vastly favor, according to the polls, a Biden outcome. Biden has been very forthright about his positive feelings for Canada. He has called Canadians part of a family. He's also very much rules-based system. And for Canada, a rules-based system is critical both in terms of our bilateral relationship with the United States, which is a much stronger country, as well as internationally. And I'll get on to the international scene, where Canada, as a middle power, relies very heavily on a rules-based system and doesn't do all that well in a realpolitik power-based system. With the prospect of a Biden outcome, Canada would see us having an easier domestic trade relationship with the United States, but at the same time, there are real economic differences sometimes, even with Democrats. And there is a case here, the Republicans with Trump, while very transactional, they're actually looking what's good for business for the United States. And sometimes it also works for Canada. It's a normal thing. And should Trump not win, we have a major pipeline with the United States for fuel called the Keystone XL pipeline, and Biden might cancel that. That would be very negative for people in Alberta, which are depending on this. So there are some nuances to this. In terms of the international system, of course, as we know, Trump has been very isolationist in terms of American presence in the world. He has officially declared he does not want the United States to be the world's international policeman. This is very contrary to his history, which was particularly embraced by the Democrats, but also by traditional Republicans. So there's been a huge shift. If Biden comes in, will he restore that role? There's reason to believe that he may try, but he may not succeed completely. The world has moved on. we have an emergence of other powers in the world that are playing a far greater role than they have even under the Obama period. So you've got Russia, China, Turkey, Iran. These countries are coming up. They are playing roles now that the United States, while it's a great power, it has the largest nuclear arsenal, so on and so forth, must still now barter a bit more. And I think we're into a new, but in fact, maybe old traditional 19th century great power rivalry, which will impose itself on a rules-based system. So for Canada, I think we have to learn to maneuver here. And whether it's Biden or Trump, I think we're into a world of high competition, power rivalries, and working hard by all of us to keep a rules-based system going for the fundamentals. We have to live with two systems almost interplaying with each other at the same time. So I think that's the view from Canada. A Biden administration would be perhaps atmospherically easier, softer, but functionally, there may not be as much as difference as people think. That's the view from Ottawa.
Thanks for that. Thanks from the view from Ottawa. Again, we'll have some time left, maybe for Q&A section, and from the whole, I think maybe about like global order, about NAFTA, about future negotiations on this topic. I guess we'll make it in the end of our discussion. Then, like, I'm still to introduce to you our next speaker, who would present to us the view how would the US election influence Latin America. We are very honored to have you today. Like, I will introduce you to our speakers and to our guests, like Mariano Agustin Caucino, honorary Plenipotentiary Ambassador, distinguished member of the Argentinian Council of International Relations, is here with us today and is going to have an introduction about the influence on American election on Latin America. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I will speak on behalf of the Council of Foreign Affairs in Argentina, and I would say that, of course, we don't know who won the election at this time of this morning here in Argentina. Everything makes you think that Biden has a better chance to become American president than President Trump, but they are still counting votes. And in any case, I would say that the first thing we have to consider is that the results of the election were much closer than what was expected. So that we can say that President Trump made a better election than it was expected. And that even if Biden wins the election, its term is not so extended as it would have been predicted. For Latin America, there is, of course, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I can speak in the case in my country, for example, in Argentina. Normally, there is a sort of contradiction because in some ways, people here in my country are in Latin America in some way, think that a democratic administration is better for Latin America than a Republican administration. But in historical terms, at least in the recent history of this region, at least since the Second World War, American administrations under Republican Party were better for Argentina than Democratic administration. And that's a sort of contradiction, but it's true in our case. In terms of the relationship between those administrations and the Argentine governments. It's related to things like protectionism and trade. Of course, the most important thing is what Latin American countries do on behalf of that relationship, because the relationship between Argentina or other Latin American countries and the US is asymmetric. It's not, of course, there is a lot of difference between the power of one country and the power of the other country. So we are going to see what happens. There is a very special point on the relationship between Brazil. Brazil is the most important country in Latin America. It has approximately half of the GDP of Latin American countries is Brazil. And there is a very special relationship between President Bolsonaro and President Trump. So we don't know what's going to happen under a Biden administration. There is a special point on the Amazon, the environmental issue, and we'll see what's happening. And then if you have more time, I can speak more about my country, but I don't want to use so much time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for you. We have a little question from our team, as well as Latin America. So like to be in very short phrase, how do you think would the attitude of United States change towards Venezuela if the administration is changed?
Well, I can say that towards Venezuela, there is a huge crisis there. That country is becoming in such a way as a failed state, in such a way. And there is a huge humanitarian crisis. Millions of people were displaced, ran out of the country. And that situation is becoming even worse in the last years. But President Trump's administration made a very hard position towards the Maduro regime. And the Democratic administration might, I think it will continue that policy. Vice President Biden, the Democrat candidate, said that Venezuela is under a dictatorship under Maduro. So everything makes me think that that policy will continue in the great lines. Maybe there are some details changing, but I don't think there's going to be a very important change in that issue.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. Yeah, so now we are moving closer to Kiev. And I guess before we start to examine our three European colleagues, I would like to give the floor to give us the perspective about how the US election would influence Africa, considered by some political scientists as continent of the tomorrow, which may be happening right now. And I am delighted to give the floor to Dr. Adedeji Adeniran, Director of Education, Governance and Research, and Senior Fellow at the Center for the Study at the Economies of Africa.
Okay, thank you, Victor, and fellow panelists and listeners. Like other panelists have mentioned, the direction of US election might not actually constitute a kind of major shift in what American government will be doing. But let me make the point that a lot of things could shape a lot of what will be the focus of incoming administration in America. For instance, are we going to have a unified government or a divided government? A unified government in which, I mean, both the executive and the legislative arms are into one party, or are we going to have that kind of division? And if you look at precedent and implication of divided government, which, I mean, projections seems likely, you would say that in the divided government, the executive tends to focus more on foreign policy. And if you have more of a unified government, you might tend to focus on domestic policy, because since there is actually no kind of arm of government trying to contain your policy direction, you try to actually push a lot of policy forward at the domestic level. But I mean, American presidents are more powerful in terms of foreign policy, and they are not much constrained. So in that respect, I would say that what we expect is under President Trump, if he wins his re-election, a continuation of his policy to Africa, which is in some ways a continuation of American policy, but not actually being led by the president himself. If you compare the administration of President Obama and of President Trump, you would see that in terms of policy like Light Africa, policy like AGOA, which is an agri policy, when you compare this to Trump policy, you find out that in terms of who is leading these initiatives, is quite different. Why? I mean, top government officials like the vice president was leading under Obama. During Trump era, it has been more of State Department kind of initiative. So the locus of control would still remain. I mean, those kind of changes we expect to see, whether Republicans or Democrats wins this election. But for Africa, I think one of the most important things going forward is the issue of trade and globalization. If you look at in January 1st, 2021, Africa would enter into a new regional integration initiative called African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is actually the biggest kind of trade alignment since WTO has taken place. And when this commences, it means that a lot of intra-African trade in Africa, but a lot of how we also, African as an entity, also redefine its policy with the rest of the world. And in that sense, the China-US conflict would play a role in this. I mean, both countries are strategic partner to Africa. Both China is the like the top trade partner, and if you look at the country that follows that is the US. In terms of ODA and in terms of investment or ODI, you see that China and Africa are competing in terms of investment in Africa. And in that respect, we would see if President Trump should win re-election, and if the kind of geopolitical tension with China subsists, that could affect to the extent to which African Continental Free Trade Agreement will take place. And it may also affect African as we look forward to electing an African as to head WTO in that regard. As a lot of people know, the major contention or power against African actually taking that position has been from the US. So it is in the area of trade, I think a major shift would be. And without saying who I would like to see as winning, I would see a more favorable impact, I mean, development in trade for Africa with a democratic government, because of probably there will be much more, less tension with China, much more avenue to for global alignment and pursuing this kind of regional integration among countries that will favor Africa to some extent. And you could see, I mean, some of American first policy of President Trump in some ways are not directly affecting Africa, but indirectly you could see the implication like withdrawal from WTO. And if you look at in terms of African COVID-19 responses, it is the multilateral institution that has actually been supporting Africans. And in that regards, policy like withdrawing from WTO and the rest would negatively affect Africa in some ways. And to that regard, I mean, you could see that maybe better US leadership in trade, better US leadership in climate change, better US leadership in COVID-19. It has a sort of way of actually reflecting, because I mean, African countries are quite, I mean, different. And we draw a lot of inspiration from Africa, from America. In my country, Nigeria, if you look at the President Trump mantra for his election, make Africa great again. If you look at the opposition in the last election in Nigeria, the same acronyms was used in terms of make Nigeria great again, which is like trying to borrow ideas from things. So when we see in terms of things not going on, when in terms of democratic governance, in terms of promotion of democracy, in terms of those global issues, you kind of see a lot of people that would draw example, either bad or good, from Africa, from America, and that is crucial to the direction or issues that will shape Africa in the coming years. So that is my contribution. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thanks a lot. When we have time, there was a discussion, we will return to Africa because I have some questions to ask. So yeah, now we are moving to Europe, and I guess we should start with the topic of transatlantic relationship. and how would the new president or the incumbent president in his second term influence the transatlantic relations said by many political analysts to reach a bottom line during these 4 years due to America first policy. And I'm delighted to announce Stefan Lehne, visiting fellow of the Carnegie Europe, today with us to speak about this topic. So, floor is yours. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Victor. I very welcome this invitation. Now, if Biden ends up being elected, which is, I think, the more likely option now, there will be a big sigh of relief in most European capitals. Not in all of them. There are some fans of Trump in Europe. You might have heard that the Slovene prime minister yesterday morning congratulated Trump on being elected, which was a little bit premature. And there are some others, mostly in East Central and Eastern Europe, who really like Trump. But the majority of leaders in Europe feel that Trump has been very destructive on the transatlantic relationship. Trump has been very hostile to the European Union. He welcomed the Brexit. He said other countries should follow UK to leave the European Union. He was very disdainful of alliances general and NATO in specifically. He put in question the defense commitment of Article 5 of the Atlantic Treaty. He launched trade wars against Europe. And generally, I think he really disrupted the relationship during his 4 years in office. Also, I think Andrew has referred to this, EU, like Canada, is very much committed to the rules-based multilateral order. And Trump has been an extremely negative impact on that by pulling out of the Paris Agreement, by undermining the Iran nuclear deal, by many other actions that he has taken. I think most clear, this is, if you look at the pandemic, this is the first global crisis where the US hasn't exerted any kind of real leadership. On the contrary, it has pulled out of the World Health Organization, the body that was supposed to address this crisis. So if Biden comes in, the tone of the transatlantic relationship will certainly change. He will bring many people who worked with Obama and with Clinton and who know their counterparts on the European side, and will have a very good basis for a conversation. But there is no return to the old transatlantic relationship. I think what is very clear now is that this decade, the 2020s and maybe the 2030s, will be dominated by the US-China rivalry. There's no question about it. This will not change if Biden comes in. There's a broad bipartisan consensus in the United States that China is the most important rival in the world today. Biden might change the methodology, but the fact of the rivalry will not go away. Now, that means that the US engagement in Europe will decline, because obviously the attention will be on the Indo-Pacific and on the Asian continent. There will not be as much time with Biden and the Secretary of State for European issues. It's also quite clear that whereas Trump didn't care about any kind of alliance relationship and attacked Europe as much as China, but looks at the alliance as a big asset in the rivalry with China. So he will try to bring Europe on his side in this rivalry. And that is a very interesting issue for the Europeans, because China is the second biggest trading partner for the EU. If there's strong US pressure to align with the US in the rivalry with China, this will have potentially an enormous economic cost. I have no doubt that ultimately Europe will be on the American side. I think the US influence in Europe is very, very strong, but it will be quite costly, and the room for maneuver for Europe might actually shrink in the Biden administration compared to the Trump administration. But on the other hand, this has to be balanced against all the pluses, and there is no question that on climate change, for instance, Europe will work much better with the Biden administration. On on the Middle East, there is much more of a coherence and agreement with Biden, and generally on the whole multilateral agenda, including trade, WTO, etc. Work with the Biden administration will be much more positive. Now, there has been a lot of talk recently in Europe about European sovereignty, strategic autonomy. The Commission has called itself the Geopolitical Commission. And all these words reflect that the feeling is that you cannot really rely on the US so much anymore. That Europe has to take care of its own problems without all the time looking at Washington and what the Americans feel about this. Not everybody shares this perspective. Last week, there was a very interesting statement by the German defense minister, Karen Bauer, who said, well, all this talk about strategic autonomy, ultimately it's unconvincing. We need the Americans' engagement. We should do nothing that diminishes the American commitment to European security. This is the wrong approach. So I think there will be probably, if Biden comes back, this kind of idea that we can somehow come back to the old relationship between the US and Europe that will gain ground, but ultimately I think it is unsustainable. Now, the second question is, what happens if Trump wins in the end? I think we can expect more nationalist, America first, erratic actions and a lack of positive engagement with Europe and in the European neighborhood. But on the other hand, one must say, I think if you look at it concretely, the bark of Trump has been worse than the bite. So basically, he said horrible things, but ultimately the US engagement in Europe did not decline substantially. He pulled some troops out of Germany, but he put them into Italy and Belgium and some other countries. And in terms of the American presence in Eastern Europe, that actually has gone up during the Trump presidency. And that's not so much because of Trump and his tweets from the White House, but that the whole American security establishment is committed to continuity in the policies of NATO, and therefore has not allowed the president to go further than he did. Also, I think Trump is not a warmonger. That has become clear in the last 4 years. We can expect a lot of nonsense and a lot of silly things, but I don't think he would be a big threat to world peace if he continues. Now, the question that many people in Austria and Europe ask themselves, some people say, well, for Europe, maybe the best thing would be another 4 years of Trump, because that will finally force Europe to pull itself together, to be more coherent, to have stronger common policies. But I personally have big doubts about this. I think if you look at it from the experience of the last 4 years, you cannot see sort of a rallying around of Europe during this period. I think generally EU foreign policy became weaker, not stronger. And I think 4 years of Trump, 4 more years of Trump will probably weaken Europe rather than strengthen it. Finally, I think we know already one result of the elections, that very clearly. The polarization of the US society will continue. Trump did much better than anybody expected. The American government will remain divided, with the Senate in the hands of the Republicans. And the US will be absorbed by its internal divisions, by its huge internal problems, by its constitutional issues, crisis that remains unresolved. And that will be, of course, distract very much from the foreign policy of this country and will be a big handicap on the external engagement of the United States of America. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I will allow one short question from my side, and I would like to have one short answer from your side. So still candidate for American presidency, Joe Biden, has written in a Foreign Affairs article that he wants to make a summit of democracy, to make them more coherent and to restore all the democratic values. As we see from polls, the confidence that Europeans used to have to Americans has fallen dramatically. So what are the odds, how do you assess it? What are the odds that the reconciliation is still possible, or isn't possible at all?
Well, I would say the United States remains the most powerful country in the world. Nothing constructive can happen in the world without active support also from the United States. So I think from the European point of view, the Europeans will engage with whatever administrations they find in Washington because there simply is no alternative. But I think the Europeans, the great majority of Europeans, believe that the Biden administration will be much more ready and committed to finding common solutions on this issue, from climate to digital to all the big issues in the world. And that the chances to come back to sort of a liberal rules-based order look a lot better if Biden is in charge.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. We are going forward. We are going now to Kiev to present the view of our fellow, senior fellow of US politics, Artur Kaldamasev. How would the elections influence the architecture of Eastern Europe? Primarily focused Poland, Baltics, and Ukraine. And then we'll go to the Belarus and Russia and the post-Soviet space. Yeah, so Artur, floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, great. So it's such an honor to be here with such an incredible and amazing panel. I think that this discussion is super fruitful and incredible, and that's a huge opportunity to talk about very important issues that we have, especially in the regions that I will be discussing now. So let's first talk about the Eastern Europe and some particular countries here. And at the end of my, let's call it a short analysis, I will talk about our country, Ukraine, and how that US elections affect our country and its politics. So let's move to Visegrad countries at first, and especially Poland, because Poland has such a strong tie and strong relations with the United States because of so many factors and reasons. And these countries are very interrelated, and they seem to be very different, but they have so many similar features in their politics. Furthermore, we could guess some patterns in American politics by the situation in the Polish politics because of these similarities. And while the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Poland officially states that it doesn't matter for them who will be the winner of the elections, actually the truth is that it matters a lot, because there are so many slight details and like small issues that can change and can affect the relations of these two countries, depending on who will win the election as the results. So these 5 small details are relations with the European Union and especially NATO. And it was discussed by Mr. Lehne earlier, but I would add only that the Biden presidency would be more suitable for the Euro-Atlantic relations, and that Biden wants to kind of rebuild this American support to European Union and especially NATO, because different analysts state that NATO is on the bottom line during that Trump presidency, and it can be even disappeared in that format that we know it at the moment. The second issue that is important is the Nord Stream 2 project, because Trump opposes it and Biden opposes it too, but on a little bit weaker scale. And this project is economically important for Poland and energetically important for Poland. So they will try to defend this project, especially with Germany. But we have to expect some confrontation on that issue that maybe will not be very seen or obvious, but it will be but it will be happening for sure. The next issue is climate change, and again, for Poland, it has its economical reasons. First of all, because the United States have so many ties with Poland in terms of energetic policy and energy overall, and the Biden-Harris plan to move to alternatives in terms of energy kind of move these projects aside, but I think that they will find a good alternative, and it will not harm Polish economy dramatically. The next small issue that I think will not be changed is the position on issues in Ukraine and Belarus, because the United States and Poland have similar positions, and it's expressed in their relations, in their statements all the time, and they show their support to protesters in Belarus and to reforms in Ukraine, and they are both helping Ukraine in fight with Russia in the conflict on the east of country. But there is one issue that can make relations of Poland and the United States a little bit more complicated. Joe Biden, sometime earlier, he expressed his concern about the human rights issues in Poland and Romania. And I think that it's adequate and suitable for that situation, because everybody knows about these LGBT-free zones in Poland and about the controversial laws on abortion and LGBT rights. And the United States, as a kind of advocacy in terms of human rights protection in the world, as the United States try to show them on that role, I think it's crucially important for Mr. Biden to show some action in that direction, and it can help to rebuild this image one more time. Let's talk about other Visegrad countries, and especially about Hungary, because the Hungarian parliament that is currently now in office supports the idea of Trump being a president another 4 years, because they expressed their concern about the democratic, quote, moral imperialism, as they call it, and the Hungarian-American relations. They were improved slightly during the Trump presidency, but that one more thing, that the victory of Trump on elections in 2016, it was the wake-up call for the populistic movements all over Europe, especially Hungary, especially Czech Republic. And I think that if Trump wins again, the populism sweep will become even stronger all over Europe, and we may expect the stronger positions of populistic governments and parties in European governments. Let's talk a bit about Western Balkans, because these are the two countries that are especially waiting on the elections results: Serbia and Kosovo. Kosovo wants Biden to win because they remember his actions during the events in Yugoslavia when NATO was involved, and they see Biden as the defender of Kosovo interests. Serbian political elites are expecting Trump to be winning because, again, because of Trump's latest effort in that direction, these famous Serbian-Kosovo agreements about the regulation of relations between these two territories. It was met in Serbia with gratitude because they see Trump as the defender of Serbian interests in that conflict. Let's call it like that. And I think that the future of Balkans in the concept of American foreign policy kind of depends on the person who will be in the office for the next 4 years. And our last stand in my report is Ukraine is our country. And for our country, it's especially important and especially difficult because we were involved in some election drama. You know, there's impeachment inquiry, some scandals with Biden family that was involved with some business in Ukraine, and all of that kind of had its impact on the American elections that are happening now. Ukraine has a very thin line to follow, and it's very difficult to do so because Ukraine has not to interfere into the American domestic politics, but at the same time, it has to get and secure this bipartisan support in terms of reforms and support in the conflict with Russia. And I think that despite the fact that maybe the general pattern of the relations will not change, we can see some slight changes and differences depending on who will be the winner of the elections. Furthermore, I think that the whole diplomatic structure of the United States will improve because during the Trump presidency, the United States had this kind of crisis of diplomatic service because there was a small connection between the Trump administration and diplomats from the United States. And I think that Ukraine is one of the examples of that crisis because still during the Trump presidency, no ambassador was appointed because of some domestic policy struggles. We had different representatives, but again, the ambassador was not selected. It was selected according to the rumors at the very last moment before the elections, but he was not appointed. So the whole thing about the impact of these elections on the Eastern Europe and Southern Europe is that, again, it all is surrounded with this NATO and European Union context. So for the improvement of these relations, the next American president has to be very positive about the development of Euro-Atlantic relations, especially for those countries that are seeking for being a part of European Union and NATO in the future. And also, when we talked about particular countries, we could see some common patterns that we discussed. But in general, I think we have to wait and see what will happen because we still don't know the election. There's unprecedented elections are going on right now in the United States. And I think we'll get almost of the answers on our questions when the winner will be finally revealed. Thank you.
Thanks for those answers. Thanks for representing our think tank in such an interesting panel today. And before we proceed to Belarus and Russia and all these post-Soviet countries, I would like to remind our spectaculars that you may leave your questions to our distinguished speakers here or in Facebook or in our Instagram. Our IT team will check it, and once we have some time left, I will pick some questions for our speakers. And now I'm delighted to give the floor to Katsiarina Shmantsina, Senior Fellow of Belarusian Institute for Strategic Studies.
Greetings, I'm happy to be here, and I will talk about the US elections in the context of the current post-election crisis in Belarus. And I would start by saying that in the past years, during the Trump presidency, the US-Belarus relations were developing in a very pragmatic vein. And in a sense that it was mostly initiated by the Belarusian MFA, which tried to sell the picture of the Belarusian leadership with authoritarian sort of inclinations. And they tried to sell this image to Washington that maybe we are not doing in the best way in terms of respect for human rights, but we are a reliable partner to deal with in terms of developing economic ties and sort of normalizing the relations and advocating for removing sanctions and restrictions which were out there imposed on Belarus in the previous years. And when it comes to the current crisis, the reaction of the US was very, very sort of timid and not decisive and very distant on the level of messages that were coming from Secretary Pompeo and other representatives of the State Department. So essentially they were saying that we let Belarusians to decide for themselves. We won't interfere in these relations. And this is something, those messages could be essentially translated in the sense that US remains distant from the current situation. They don't want to trigger Russia in any way in the current situation. And in the time when EU countries were speaking more loudly regarding the unraveling crisis in Belarus for the scope of human rights violations, the US leadership reaction was rather distant. And then when Secretary Pompeo initiated a call with President Lukashenko in past weeks, he initiated the release of the US citizen who is also a Belarusian, Vitaly Shklarov, political consultant who was unlawfully prosecuted for political reasons and held in prison in Belarus. So the statement that Pompeo made later on the release of this person, it touched on the sense that Trump won't tolerate the intimidation of the US citizens. And there was virtually nothing about the 100 political prisoners currently in Belarus held sort of captives in the current crisis. And so I think that if Trump wins again, then those relations would, bilateral relations between Washington and Minsk would further develop in a very pragmatic way, seen through the lens of pure pragmatism, in a sense that Minsk, overall, Belarus is interesting for Washington only in the sense that it remains a stable country which does not pose a threat to regional security in the way it does not intimidate Russia's interests, or to the extent that, let's say, if China moves towards closer cooperation with Belarus with some sort of investment projects or competing in terms of technological rivalry, that's when the US interest is and would be sparked toward Belarus. And then when we talk about Biden, on the other side, he was much more vocal about supporting the Belarusian democratic opposition, condemning Trump's awkward silence on the situation, and also saying that if he becomes president, he would work in coordination with EU, Canada, to facilitate some sort of mediation under OSCE and encourage some sort of political solution for Belarus. And so it might seem quite obvious that Biden would be more active in general for leading U.S. Foreign policy, to be more active to promote U.S. global role and U.S. role in the Eastern European region in particular. But on the other side, there is still some caveat. I would say that the intra-democratic debate on, there is sort of the intra-democratic debate on the foreign policy priorities, in a sense that some part of the democratic groups stand for more liberal internationalism, for US being more active in promoting democracy, liberal internationalist values globally. And then there will be another group of Democrats who just stand merely for Obama-style policy, with sort of pivoting to Indo-Pacific region, to be less active in this democratic promotion ideals. And in that sense, I think that like if this group prevails in inside and foreign policy priorities, we might not see that much change for Belarus. Like there won't be any direct impact if the US leadership changes. But I would also say that even at the time when Trump administration was very distant and not interested in the issues around Belarus, even at that time, State Department issued, I mean, in the previous years, they did issue several reports on the situation in Belarus with human rights and did bring attention to those issues, which made it harder for the lobbyists on the Hill to promote the idea of removing completely sanctions from the Belarusian autocratic leadership. And also currently there is a act considered, there is like a draft Belarus democracy draft bill considered on the Hill regarding to support for Belarus and for the current crisis. And what is important is that it has bipartisan support, even in the current composition of the Trump administration and the current composition of political forces and the decision makers in Washington. And I think I'll stop here and join at the Q&A session.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that. So now we are moving east. We will come once to Israel and then to Pakistan. So I'm delighted to announce Nadav Tamir, Dr. Nadav Tamir, CEO of Paris Center for Peace, a former advisor of the president of Israel, Shimon. So the floor is yours, but I would like that you would concentrate your speech on one point. So we know that Biden approach towards the Middle East and the Trump's approach towards the Middle East, well, it is evident from their speeches, from their discussions, from what they say about Saudi Arabia, about the Gulf, etc., 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 are two distinct tracks, but they seem to be united on the question of supporting the independence of Israel. So how do you think, what is the change to be awaited once the presidents will change in the United States? So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Victor, and thank you for all of you. And it's an honor to be part of this distinguished panel. As a disclaimer, I will say that as an Israeli, I represent a very small portion of the Middle East, a very small country in this region, and I'm also representing a very small, not very small, but a minority in Israel who don't approve of the popularity of Trump in Israel, and Trump is indeed popular in Israel. But I will try to be fair to the other perspectives. First of all, it's important to say Biden, as a senator, as a chairman of the foreign committee of the Senate, as vice president, is very well known. And in general, his policies will be much more predictable because he will go back to the interagency process and not act according to whims and tweets and things like we saw from Trump. You know, when I was trying to at least understand some of the rationale of the Trump policies in the Middle East, which was very hard because there were many contradictions, I find kind of four major parameters. One is narcissism. You know, for example, to take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict without getting into any details and just saying, I'm going to do the deal of the century because I'm the great negotiator. And we saw that also with North Korea, getting into a summit without any preparation just because of this feeling that I can do what others cannot do. The second thing is trying to be opposite of Obama on everything. So, for example, if someone would bring Trump the JCPOA and tell him, listen, it's your agreement, you actually designed it, he would say it's the best agreement in the world and will sell it as a great success. The third one, which is actually not very different than Obama, is trying to move away from the Middle East. And this is a more structural issue for America. It's not just a Trump and Biden thing. America was very invested in the Middle East because of the energy resources, but now America is much more energy independent. It doesn't need the energy of the Middle East as much, and also all the interventions in the Middle East were a great failure. Whether it's going all the way in Iraq, leading from behind in Libya, or doing nothing about Syria, didn't lead to much. So I think there is an understanding in America in general that the Middle East is not a great place to invest treasury and soldiers. And I think in many ways Biden will stay with that approach, even though I think the diplomacy will be much smarter. The last thing that is very relevant for Israel is the political base of Trump, which is mostly evangelical Christians, around 80 million in numbers, that are, that their theology is that success of Israel will eventually bring the Messiah back. Jesus Christ will return after the Armageddon war, where we will all Jews will become eventually either Christian or dead. But during the way, they expect Israel to succeed, and even though they don't like the family values of Trump and other things, they support him for two reasons: Israel and the Supreme Court. That is another thing. And for example, when Trump decided to move the embassy to Jerusalem, the timing was exactly when there was a Senate race in Alabama, which is a big evangelical state, and the move was intended to help the Republican senator. It didn't help much, but anyhow, that was one of the reasons for the move. Now, Biden will go back to a much more traditional foreign policy in general, not only in the Middle East, but I think that he will keep this line that was also mentioned by our colleague from Europe, that Asia is much more important, and in the Middle East, let's just try to avoid big crises and do whatever you can with diplomacy, but not spend too much resources. Now, in most of the Middle East, Trump is very popular. Is very popular for several reasons. From the Israeli perspective, because he was very good to Netanyahu. In many ways, the same base of Trump politically, the evangelicals, are very similar to the base of Netanyahu in Israel, the right-wing settlers, the Orthodox community. Trump, in terms of the Jewish community in America, which is very small, it's only 2% of Americans, but very influential politically, is much more close to the Orthodox religious Jews than to the big numbers of the Jewish community, which are much more secular or reform, that are much more liberal. So they have the same political base, and many people in Israel don't separate between what's good for Netanyahu and what's good for Israel, because, but I make this separation because I think that history is going to judge it very differently. I think that Trump was very bad for Israel on the long term, and I can explain why. But in general, if you check things in historical manner, you will see that the presidents that really benefited Israel strategically were not very popular. Whether it's Carter, that thanks to him, we have the peace with Egypt, the most important strategic development, a peace with the strongest and largest Arab country in the world. And also Bush first, Bush 41, that used the first Gulf War in order to create a new alliance, and also built on the end of the start of the end of the Cold War in order to create a new alliance, and also dragging Shamir, the Israeli prime minister at the time, to the Madrid conference. And the Madrid conference opened up a lot of diplomatic relations for Israel with China, with India, with many other countries, and also led eventually to the Oslo Accords, which again, many Israelis think is not good for us. I think it was good for Israel. So most Israelis, the more right-wing Israelis, which, in the last at least decade, it's also our government, see Trump as a great friend of Israel. But I want to claim that what he did in the Middle East is not very helpful to Israel long-term interest, and I'll explain. I think moving out of the Iranian deal, even though it seems taking our side, but it's actually made Iran much closer to a bomb. It crushed the international alliance that is the only way to bring Iran to some compromise, because America on its own cannot do it. And it's also strengthened the more extreme parts of the Iranian regime, those from the Revolutionary Guards, rather than the Zarifs and the Rouhani part that prefer an acting Iranian economy than hegemony in the Middle East. So I think that history will prove that it was not good for Israel, but for the Israeli government, for most of the Israeli people, and for the Sunni countries in the Middle East, it looked as if Trump was much more powerful with Iran, and that's why he is much more popular. Another reason why I think many leaders in the Middle East prefer Trump is because he doesn't deal with human rights much. He doesn't really care how they, what was called by one of the speakers as the moral imperialism. In the Middle East, leaders prefer Americans not to deal with the way they run their country or judge them on the level of democracy. So I would say in general, most of the people in the Middle East like Trump better. But if you ask me what are the long-term interests of Israel and the Middle East, I think we need America to lead the free world. And I think Biden will go back to leading the free world, which Trump didn't care much about, whether it's on climate change or in pandemic prevention or in proliferation of nuclear weapons. We need American strong diplomacy. And I think there are more chances that Biden will do it. I think that going back to smart diplomacy also in terms of looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not as a zero-sum game, but as a conflict that there is a win-win formula, which is the two-state solution, is much better for both Palestinians, Israelis, and the Arabs in general. So I think there is a big distinction between what the Middle East think that they want to what I analyze as what's good to the Middle East. So I hope I was at least fair enough to present the feelings of people that I don't agree with.
Yes, thanks for that. Such an interesting perspective to hear, because ones who think about Israel, who think that they are so excited with the fact that Trump is making all for Israel. So it was such an interesting thing to hear. Now we're moving more east, and I'm delighted to announce our last but not the least speaker, because as I have mentioned before, Africa may be the continent of tomorrow, but Asia is the continent of today. So our distinguished speaker will center on the Asia Pacific, and I'm delighted to give the floor to Asif Durrani, Extraordinary Plenipotentiary Ambassador, Senior Research Fellow of the Islamabad Policy Research Institute. Sorry for making you wait for so long for having an introduction, but I guess you will say us more things that we may even expect about the Asia Pacific. So floor is yours. Looking forward for your input.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you for inviting me to this very important webinar and a very important theme. In fact, I have more focused on impact of the US presidential elections on Asia Pacific. And much has been said about other issues by previous speakers, and those were quite enlightening for me. And definitely it has given a global perspective. And thank you, Victor, for collecting such a galaxy of scholars from all over the world that you have almost covered the whole globe. With regard to US presidential elections, I think these were the most contentious elections in the country's history. And I tend to agree with Andrew that when the United States sneezes, the world catches the cold. He only restricted to Canada, but I think when the United States sneezes, the world catches the cold. So definitely there has been quite a lot of interest about the elections. And when you look at it domestically, then I think both the candidates have been facing challenges arising due to racial disturbances, manhandling of COVID-19, and economic downturn. So this has been the hallmark of the whole election campaign. On the foreign policy front, you see the US's withdrawal from international forums and organizations such as WHO, UN Human Rights Organization, Paris Climate Agreement, so and transatlantic partnership. So this has been the case. So, and then there have been sanctions against Iran, and which have created multiple power centers without common approaches to global problems. Then I would like to just briefly touch upon President Trump's severe criticism of China that has become the major plank in his election campaign, and which had put Mr. Biden on the defensive, who has already been accused by President Trump as soft on China. In fact, his election slogan was that if Biden wins, China wins. So this has been the. I have heard these kind of diatribe for the first time in the American election campaign. Then, of course, much to President Trump's credit, I think signing of the Abraham Accords by UAE, Bahrain, and now Sudan, I think that can rightly go to President Trump's credit. And I think he has had the overwhelming support from the Jewish community in the United States, and I think that was intended. But as our friend Nader Tamir has said, that there have been quite divergent views about this Abraham Accords, if I have understood him correctly, then I think on the whole, it has also created tensions across the Strait of Hormuz. Now, Iran, as he has rightly pointed out, that now I think after withdrawal from JCPOA, Iran would look more towards the bomb. If not that, but again, the tensions would be there. And because the Arab states, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, they wanted to block Iran somehow. And JCPOA, which provided an opportunity for both, I mean, Iran to come back to the mainstream, but it was seen as a danger by the Gulf states, conservative Gulf states. So it had, the tensions are there, and it is very much there. Then when I see for Pakistan, then I think things are not going to change with either of the candidates winning, as Pakistan would be looked at from the Afghan prism and the achievement of American objectives in Afghanistan. Including a peace accord between President Ashraf Ghani and the Taliban, as well as retention of American bases in that country. And so therefore, in the obtaining the situation, Pakistan will have to tread carefully while navigating through the US-China rivalry. But one thing is clear, that China is a trusted friend for Pakistan, while US is a transactional ally. So the choice for Pakistan should not be difficult. Now, focusing on Asia Pacific and its impact, then I think US has the US Asia Pacific strategy and focuses is China specific. And its coercive arm appears to be now acquired, which is US, India, Japan, and Australia, which is in fact conducting joint military exercises also. So the purpose is to choke Malacca Straits in the Asia Pacific to block China. If that's the case, then there may be several reasons. I think we have to look at the reasons which has caused tensions between China and the US. And the foremost being the astronomical rise of China in in trade and innovative technologies, which has caused friction in the American business and strategic circles. China's announcement of launching 5G technology came as a shock for the American businesses and strategic community. Simply put, it would mean trillions of dollars coming to China, which deprived the Americans for lagging behind in maintaining their supremacy in IT. Then Belt and Road Initiative, which encompasses Asia, Europe, and Africa. So in that respect is another initiative which would establish China's influence upon the beneficiaries of Asia, Europe, and Africa. For Pakistan, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is a game changer. And it is also a backbone to the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. So that needs to be kept in mind. Then US-India strategic partnership is a source of concern for Pakistan. Recently, on a bilateral exchange cooperation agreement signed between the US and India will disturb the balance in air warfare with grave consequences. And mind you, this agreement was signed just 1 week before the presidential elections. So one can very well look at and read the tea leaves, how those are going to predict the future. So therefore, Pakistan cannot remain oblivious of this development. India has already created a new normal under the nuclear overhang by attacking Balakot area of Pakistan last year. Of course, that was responded to by Pakistan, but it did create tensions between the two countries. And then the situation has further aggravated because India took action on 5th of August last year by reoccupying the Jammu and Kashmir state. And then they have actually, in fact, they are trying to change the demography of that occupied state, which is a disputed state and which has to be decided according to the UN supervised plebiscite. But India has followed that. And that is the one reason that when they issued the new maps showing it as occupied state as part of India, it has also caused friction with China, which is why then you have seen the recent military standoff between China and India. And it has caused more tensions in this. So in the ongoing tensions between the US and China, if that continues, then I can foresee emergence of new alliances between China, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, and Turkey. That cannot be ruled off. So here, but there would be a difference, I think, as rightly pointed out by my previous worthy scholars. There'll be a difference. While President Trump, he has been inward looking, and he tried to, he has been quite noisy on that count, and he has, in fact, damaged the multilateralism. Mr. Biden is more likely to be traditionalist, as pointed out by our earlier speaker. He'll be more traditionalist, and I think he believes in multilateralism also. So that would be a big plus for him. And Mr. Trump, to his credit, I can say on Afghanistan, and also full marks should be given to him, that he has not opened up new fronts which the United States has been doing in the past. If you look at it, a slightly history and most recent history, United States since 9/11 has conducted combat operations in 24 different countries since 2001, and remains officially at war with at least 7. And it is fighting the longest war in history in Afghanistan, and millions have been displaced as a consequence of these interventions. Then similarly, it has also cost the United States dearly because according to one estimates conducted by the Brown University's cost of war project estimates, say that it has cost taxpayers almost $6 trillion because otherwise that money could have been spent on healthcare, education, infrastructure, clean energy, and public health. And we should also not forget that the number of the kind of, if this 9/11 and attack on Afghanistan was intended to counter so-called extremism, so Sunni Islamist militants around the world have quadrupled from 2001 to 2018 than whatever the purpose was in the past. And I should also quote a RAND study, which was conducted in 2018, and it said that since 9/11, more than 60,000 service members have been killed or wounded, and many have come home with permanent life-altering injuries, and 83% of the post-9/11 veterans report living with post-traumatic stress disorders. So these are the all cumulative effects which have taken place. And so when you compare it between Trump and Biden, or previous American administrations, whether conservative or Democrats. So now I think reality is dawning upon everyone that they have to actually look at the world from a realist lens rather than being the #1 superpower. So I think that if they're keeping that in mind, while we may say that there will be only a difference in the forms or the style of Mr. Biden if he comes to power, but my personal view is that I think the U.S. state institutions are hardly likely to change their policies in near future. So I'll stop here, and I think then we can further dwell on the question and answer session. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thanks a lot for your intervention. So before we pass to the Q&A, I guess we'll have the time, but I would like to pose one very crucial question to all of us, because as you noted, so the expression was such roots of a galaxy of scholars. The point of the galaxy of scholars is to present how to pursue the world order, because the world order in Kiev is one thing, world order in Ottawa is the second one, in Tel Aviv, in Belarus, in Nigeria, in Pakistan, in Europe. So like we're all speaking about the world order, international relations, we're reading the same books, we're listening to the same podcast, but the way we interact with the world and how we pursue the world is way different. So like my question, so like a question from the moderator is, how do you think the elections affect the world order? Because we won't be speaking today, like all of us, about the United States if United States were unimportant to the world. We're speaking about United States with all of such as brilliant speakers, because United States matter. It matters for Latin America, it matters for Africa, it matters for Europe, it matters for Asia. So yeah, and we'll start from Ottawa to Pakistan, but before, so like I would like to be a short answer, like maybe not a very short one, but not a huge one. But before we proceed to this part, I guess Nadav Tamir wanted to make a correction about the Abraham Accord. So like, floor is yours. After the correction, we will starting from the Ottawa to answer the most, I guess, invaluable questions to my mind about the nature and the state of the world order. Which world order do we have, like post-Westphalian, multipolar world order, or something else? And I guess it's the most crucial questions to come up with in our discussion. But first of all, Nadav Tamir, floor is yours.
Yeah, I just want to clear one thing, because I might have been misunderstood because of my criticism over Trump. I think I'm both the move of the embassy to Jerusalem and the Abrahamic Accords. I'm happy to have all the embassies in Jerusalem. It is our capital, and I don't think it makes a big difference if the American ambassador lives in Jerusalem or not. But for me, the way to check all those things is how it influences the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That for me is the most important issue. The most important issue because there is only one existential threat on Israel. It's not Iran, it's not Hezbollah, it's not Hamas. If we will not be able to separate the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean into two states and help the Palestinians create their own state, eventually we will have to choose between being a democracy or being a homeland for the Jewish people. And the only way to keep us both, which is what the Zionist dream is to help the Palestinians have their own state. And that's why I think that the move of the embassy to Jerusalem or the Abrahamic Accord, I see it in this lens. Is it helpful for the Palestinian issue or not? I think the way the American embassy moved to Jerusalem, which kind of Trump said, I'm moving the Jerusalem out of the table, was not helpful to the two-state solution. On the other hand, I think that the Abrahamic Accords can help the Palestinian issue, even if it was not the inclination of Trump and Netanyahu, who actually preferred to annex more settlements. But, you know, I think it was Hegel who said that sometimes history has its own wisdom. So I think that the Abrahamic Accords can help because it brings the less, the less religious part of the Arab world to the region. And rather than Turkey and Qatar or Iran influence, if we could use the more moderate forces, at least in terms of like UAE, like Bahrain, like eventually also Saudi Arabia, I think it could help the Palestinian issue. But even if some Israelis thought that this is a way to ignore the Palestinian issue and to normalize relations for Israel. So I'm supportive of the Abrahamic Accords. I just don't want them to be used in order to avoid the Palestinian issue, but actually to help solve the Palestinian issue. Sorry, it was too long.
Yeah, thanks for this. No, it's okay, because we have like audience from different regions like hearing us today. So like for them, this may be something new or something like and some aspects of it may be known. So I guess any correction is good. So yeah, we'll start with the second part, greetings to Ottawa. We'll start with Mr. Andrew, but I would like to ask you to answer my question in a very timely manner because we are practically running out of time. We have 30 minutes left, and I hope I might ask some questions from the Q&A session. So, like, floor is yours.
Thank you. Very quickly then. I think we see an emerging consensus, certainly amongst the speakers here, that with the Biden administration, we would see a return to a more international rules-based system, a traditional American assertiveness of leadership, and so on. My only caveat to that is I don't think there's any going backwards in history. I think we're moving more to a more multilateral world. The Trump period has brought in American isolationism. Biden may try to reverse that, but I think only to some degree. I think we are in a new world of great power competition based on top of an international rules-based system. And we're going to all have to learn to deal with that. And that's part of life.
Okay, thanks for that. Now moving south, like moving to Latin America. So like greetings to Buenos Aires. So Mr. Caucino, can you hear us? Yeah. So floor is yours. How do you think the system is going to be changed, or would it change at all?
I think that if Biden is elected president, there is going to be a chance for going back to the multilateral system. But the problems that we have in the world today between great power competition and the lack of coordination of some of these very important policies, I think that they are going to persist in some way, because the stage in which the world is developing has not been created by Donald Trump, but Donald Trump was the emergence of that crisis. I would say that some problems that the world has faced increasingly since the end of the Cold War, they will subsist, and there is going to be a very important task for the world leaders to fix this situation. But I'm not so optimistic in the way that some people think that a Biden presidency will fix all these situations, because there are many problems behind, and not just the character of President Trump. For example, the very bad relationship between the U.S. government and Russia, which is a very important topic for the peace and security in the whole world, is something that is developing in the last 20 years. And that situation was unfolded during the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and the Obama administration. And every administration tried to fix that situation, and then it ended worse than it had begun. And that it has something to do with the lack of the same understanding of the causes of the end of the Cold War between Russia and the United States. In the present circumstances in which China is a rising power in the world, and when we have we are developing a clash between China and the United States, wherever that takes place, with or without direct confrontation, I think that Russia's situation is very important for the West. So to develop a better relationship between the West and Russia will be fundamental for the peace and the security in the world, and to contain China's rising.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. So we're coming to Nigeria. So I am quite excited in this possibility to travel through borders in 1 second. And I guess it's one huge thing which our panel is based on. So like we're traveling now to Nigeria. What do you think about this?
Okay. Thanks, Victor. How would the event in America shape the world going forward? So for me, I think this panelists have highlighted the important fact that with Biden presidency, I mean, we expect more of return to multilateralism and the rest. But I think one thing that would actually, I see it as intersection of two factors: who wins the US election, and how do we resolve COVID-19 crisis? Because it's about how are we going to resolve this crisis as individual countries, like Trump emphasized, or are we going to come together to resolve it? Because I mean, it's a long journey. You have to hand the health problem, then the economic problem that will result. In developing countries, I mean, recovery efforts could take a year to two. And even in developed countries, I mean, the recovery will not be so smooth. And it's about going backward, how the world was able to respond to global financial crisis in 2007 and 2008. Can we actually shape another global agenda that would help us resolve this? And I think I will put much better on rebuilding such a coalition of global leaders and developing countries to resolve that crisis under a Biden regime. So I look forward to everyone from Africa.
I guess some technical.
Seeing this problem as an estimate together and design a platform that just to the need of individual countries. So nationalism is not the way forward.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. Now we're traveling through our panel to Europe. So we'll start with Stefan. So voice yours.
Thank you very much. You know, the international institutional architecture that we have at the moment was created by the United States after the Second World War. And after the end of the Cold War, there was a brief American moment, unilateral moment, where people believed, many people in Europe believed, that you can build a rules-based multilateral world order on the basis of this institutional architecture. But there was a shift in the world power towards Asia. There were China and other countries came up. The US became less influential, less dominant, and this consensus on the values and the consensus on the institutions weakened a lot. And in a way, we went back to the 19th century. Sort of geopolitics came back, big power competition came back, regional struggles for hegemony came back. And of course, the whole UN system, institutional system, was weakened as a result. And in a way, you see the Trump's administration was the kind of logical consequence of that, because he completely abandoned any commitment to multilateralism. He went to the UN and said, basically, every country has to struggle for its own interests, and all this multilateral cooperation and the rules are basically nonsense. Now, at the same time, I think we have to note that in order to deal with climate change, in order to deal with the pandemic, in order to deal with the world food supply, with economic development, financial cooperation, you need a structure, you need some order. And that, I think, for me, is probably the most significant difference between Biden and Trump, that with Biden, you have a recommitment to these rules and to these institutions. I don't think he will be strong enough to really suddenly start building the new order, the multilateral order again, but at least he's interested in that. And I think with good allies in all parts of the world, in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, he can make a difference.
Alors, we are going now to hear our fellow from our think tank. So, Arthur, what do you think about the aforementioned? Stefan, thanks for the brilliant comments.
Yeah, actually, all of the opinions of our speakers are super incredible, and I think I agree with most of them, especially if we talk about the issue of COVID crisis resolving that was mentioned by Mr. Adeniran. And I think in that context, we can mention the relations in China that are super important in terms of the world order, and especially as the relations between China and the United States worsened to that point that it became almost the situation before the Cold War. I think that China will be super glad if Trump wins, because it seems that they have super confrontation, but the non-existence and lack of strategy and particular order in how Trump build his policy towards China kinda gave China the path for the world leadership, and also allowed to the Chinese government and officials, policymakers, decision makers to kind of tell the weak spots and detect the weak spots in that strategy and use them in their favor. So if we consider Biden as a president, he wants to pressure on China with the international alliances, with the international support. And I think that with both of these presidents, the Chinese-American relations are on the point of no return. They will not be as good as they were during the Obama presidency. But I think that if Trump thinks that China is the enemy, I think that Biden sees China as the strategic competitor, and these are two different things, because Biden sees China as the competition for the US, not the enemy, and it kind of shapes his policy around it. Also, I think that the victory of Trump in 2016 brought some chaos to the world system that we had now. And also, as I mentioned before, it was a wake-up call for the populistic movements around Europe and around the world. We have to mention the Brazilian example with Mr. Bolsonaro as the president, with a kind of similar patterns to the Trump's policy. And also, if Trump wins one more time, it can make these trends even stronger, and we can see even more populistic movements appearing in a stronger mode. If we talk about the general pattern, I think that I would agree that the Biden presidency would bring more strategy, more cooperation to the international order and international system, and Trump's presidency will continue to kind of bring that chaos, surprises, and unexpectancy to the international order. And I guess I saw it in Hungary today, as I remember. There, I think that I can describe these two approaches by two simple phrases. If Trump thinks that America first, without the point between these two words, Biden thinks America point first. So I think it describes their policies in the best way, because Trump puts the American interest on the first place, not taking into account the general situation in the whole world. And I think Biden tries to bring back the leadership role for the United States on a better scale in terms of the global policeman, if we can call it like that, and the global model for human rights protection and etc. But of course, the domestic context will be super important too. So I think that this is the most important elections in the United States in recent years, at least since 2000, I guess.
Yeah, okay, thanks Sato for that. So Katsiarina, floor is yours. How do you assess it? How to assess the world order we are about to face, or we are facing right now?
I'm a huge proponent of the liberal international order, and I do not say that like everything is perfect in terms of upkeeping those ideals that the liberal international order has its core, and I'm certainly not idealistic about claiming that the US global role is sort of perfect in all dimensions. But currently, US has the capacity to upkeep this order, and I think that the way to go for the major powers, for the liberal minded powers, is to make it more inclusive, to seek a solution how to accommodate the rising powers, to seek, let's say, like if they have those more autocratic tendencies, and by this I mean like China and Russia, who challenge the current status quo and seek to have a better seat and better say at the table. So I think that the current major powers, by this I mean the US and EU, could and should work together to preserve the liberal international order and to seek ways to make it more inclusive. And then I think in that way that Biden presidency would guarantee that US has a more constructive say at this at the upkeeping and promoting the liberal order. And then if Trump maintains as president, then I think we would see more, again, pragmatic and transactional style foreign policy solutions, and US would further withdraw from its current agreements and from its global role.
Yeah, thanks, Katsiarina. Okay, Nadav, Tamir, the next one.
Yes, so I have to agree with everything that was said, which is, I guess, not as interesting, but you know, we have to choose between the alternatives that we have, and some of the things are structural, and it doesn't, you know, it's not about Trump or Biden, of course, and I agree about the significance of China, but still there is a big difference, because I think that for me as a former diplomat, the most important thing about diplomacy is try to get to win-win situations and to avoid the zero-sum situations. And I think Trump looked at the world in a very zero-sum way. For example, the China thing, the trade war maybe hurt China somewhat, but it hurts America and the world economy altogether. The TPPA, which Obama tried to promote as a way to deal with China, was a much more, I think, a constructive way. The same, of course, with pandemics. Instead of blaming China and the World Organization, Obama, you know, dealt with the Ebola pandemic in Africa before it even reached the rest of the world by international coordination. So I think, and also in terms of the populism, it's true that Trump and Orban and Bolsonaro and Duterte and all those populist leaders are an outcome of a sentiment that is anti-globalization and kind of anti-modernization and going back to the kind of more identity culture, but they also influence. There is a dialectic process where leaders are influenced by, the more materialistic Marx way and the more Hegelian way, and that they also, and I do think that a Trump win will give another wind to this populism wave around the world. So I definitely think that for all of us who believe in a world that even with competition should try to create some win-win situation for everybody, Biden presidency is a much better result for the world.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, Mr. Asif, what do we think about the whole our aforementioned discussion and the point made by the previous speakers?
Well, thank you, Victor. I think you mentioned about that each individual country looks at the world and globe through their own perspective, and I think when we talk about this whole globe and this world, and when we try to apply the U.S. presidential candidates, whether it's Trump or Joe Biden, the main issue is that this world has seen a semblance of peace after the Second World War, and it was the United Nations which gave the platform. And multilateralism has been the bane of this whole exercise. But this, over a period, now is getting eroded, especially once the United States became the superpower, the only superpower, and there was a hope that the things would get and the globalization would be the currency, but it has not happened. In fact, the rise of China actually has created more challenges to the United States power, and this has also given birth to different power centers. And then United States power is being challenged in different manner and different ways. Look at it that a ragtag militant group of Taliban in Afghanistan with the superpower, the hyperpower, the world's only power, and it had to have suffered the fatigue for the past 2 decades, and it is the longest war of America in its history. So, I think now the diktats are being challenged. Earlier, the United States could dictate the terms. Even now, it is dictating the terms, but now there are challengers. And if United States will have to realize, their candidates will have to realize, their institutions will have to realize that this world, our wishes cannot become their command to the rest of the world. So I think my take would be that there is a need for strengthening the multilateral processes for the peace and stability at the regional and global level. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for that. Okay, so we have 11 minutes left, and I guess we may take a few extra minutes, and we'll proceed towards Q&A session. So our team has sent me some questions from Facebook, from our Instagram, from the discussion, from our private account of our think tank, etc., etc., etc. Thanks to their support, I managed to pick someone. So I'll ask one question to each speaker, and I very ask you to answer it in a very timely manner, in order not to disappoint our audience and our speakers waiting and being right now. So we'll start from the directions we have made 2 times. So we'll start with Ottawa and end with Islamabad, and that will be the end of our panel discussion for today. I hope so. So question for Ottawa is the following. How do Canadians assess America as not as a global power, but as a limiter of power? So what is their attitude towards America and towards Americans in terms of politics?
Well, the Canadians, Americans are our closest neighbor, but Canadians have a very different political culture. And whether it's French or English, we have a view of peace, order, and good government, American life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And I will say that if you look at the COVID, the battle against the virus, the Canadian battle has been far more successful than the American one. And that, I think, reflects our political culture, which is more of a communal, cooperative culture. Having said that, we are different, but we have to get along with the United States. They are right next to us. As I said at the beginning, they are the elephant, we are the mouse, and we work with them. We get along with them, but we are different. And I think that's there's a consensus of Canadians on that.
Yeah, okay, sense was that now. Moving to Buenos Aires, we have the question from our team, so like from parts of our team, about, so like the question is the following. As we envisioned it being in Eastern Europe, so Argentina would like to be powerful as well as, or even more powerful as Brazil. So how do you assess the chances of like Argentina to compete with Brazil in Latin America with the view to US like position? So we now say that like relations between Brazil, Bolsonaro, is Trump are on the unexpected and unprecedented levels. So how do you assess this or correlation of factors in terms of the power play in Latin America? I understand that the question may be answered like during 10 or 15 minutes, but we are running out of time, so a short answer would be privileged. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. In the case of Latin America, or especially we are talking about the southern corner, in this case, Brazil is #1 country in this region. It has 5 more population than Argentina. But till 1960s, 50 or 60 years ago, Argentina's economy was larger than Brazil. It was the largest economy in this region. But after that, Argentine economy declined to the extent that today, Argentine's economy is approximately the same as Colombia. Maybe even it might be even shorter than Colombia, smaller than Colombia. So in this case, unfortunately for us, for Argentines, but that's the truth, I have to tell the truth, Argentina is a country that suffered a lot in the power transition in this region, and it became a less important power in this region in terms of hard power. In terms of soft power, it still is a very important country in the Ibero-American world. In Latin America and even in Ibero-American world, it's still a very important country, and you have to take account that Brazil is a country in which Brazilians speak Portuguese. So we are the same culture in terms of Latin American culture, but it's a different culture in terms of language. In terms of language, Argentina is still very important in the Spanish-speaking world.
Yeah, thanks for that. Okay, so like I would like to ask the next question to Mr. Adeniran about the Africa and United States. So like we can't see him right now. So the question is the following: which are 3 steps to be made for United States in order to compete with China in Africa? So I guess we might have some like technical questions with it, and we are moving forward. So we'll retrace it back. So once the connection will be restored. So like, Stefan, are you here with us? Yeah, so like you are here with us. So questions for you is the following about the power play and the interplay. Hasn't the Europe Does the Europe want to get rid of United States as a Lord Protector and build a new build a new chain of relationships centered more on equal partnership?
Well, there are different views in Europe. Traditionally, France, for instance, was always very interested in becoming more independent from the United States and saw itself as the leader of a Europe that can manage its own things. Mr. Macron speaks about European sovereignty all the time and European autonomy and doing our own thing. I think Germany, which is probably the most powerful country in Europe, is schizophrenic. They have some sympathy for Mr. Macron's ideas, more autonomy for Europe, but there are also traditional transatlantic feelings very strong in Germany. And in the Central European countries, the new member states of the European Union, you have on the whole a very strong transatlantic feeling, because they still feel the only country that can protect them from Russia is the United States. So on these issues, it's an open discussion that will go on for many years. I think Europe takes certain steps in the direction of autonomy, about self-determination, but we're still far away from that.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. So like Artur, you are the next. How important is United States for Ukraine? So in few words.
I mean, the United States are crucially important for Ukraine and Ukrainian reforms, because there are so many agencies and so many resources involved in different projects in Ukraine, both in the soft power mode and other diplomatic fields. Also, the United States is a crucial part of the world support in our conflict with Russia. So I think that Ukraine has to have very good relations with that country to kind of become an integrated part of the European community, and also to become a better country, and to gain success in their fight with Russia, and also to have a good position in Europe again. But I think that also Ukraine does not have to forget about its own interest, and it has to be a partnership. And I think that Ukrainian and American relations on that stage are really a partnership. And I hope that even after these elections, these ties will become stronger, and these relations will become better. Also, one more time, thanks to all the members of our panel, and your answers were super incredible, and it was such a nice thing to be a part of it. Thank you so much one more time.
Yeah, so like Stefan is also about to be leaving, so thanks all for participating, and our panel is like having its final records. So Katsiarina, questions for you, like in a timely manner to be answered. So Russians were betting for Trump in elections in 2016, but now they seem to be divided on whom they are betting now.
I think I can better speak about Belarusian situation, not so much about like Kremlin foreign policy priorities. And I would say that Belarusians understand that they are nowhere near among the US top foreign policy agenda. And actually, in the context of our very cold, distant relations in the past 10 years, between Belarus and US, we sort of forgot how it feels like to have a full-fledged diplomatic ties with the US, and how it feels like to have active US role in the region and US interest towards Belarus. And for current crisis in Belarus, we mainly count on ourselves. And when we call for international mediation under, let's say, OSCE umbrella, we mainly think about Russia's interests and how to make Russia a stakeholder in this mediation in a constructive way. And we also mainly count on the US leadership, on the European leadership in the situation, mainly reaching out to Macron, Merkel, other European leaders, and and we do not have that much maybe expectations, aspirations that the US would eventually jump in and try to solve this current crisis.
Yeah, okay, thanks, understood, noted. So, Nadav, Tamir, questions for you. So we, as far as we understand, the United States are about to be leaving the Middle East. So they don't want to be engaged in regional wars. They want to create Arab NATO or something of this. Do you believe in the Middle East with a small presentation of United States in it or not?
Well, I think, you know, as an Israeli, I would want the United States to remain in the Middle East because, you know, we don't have the deep relations or the leverage when it comes to Russia or to Turkey or Iran, of course. And you see what's happening now in Syria without the United States is very bad for Israel because it's between Iran, Turkey, and Russia. But I can understand why, from the American point of view, it is less beneficial to remain in the Middle East. I think Israel should try to help the US to remain in the Middle East in different ways. For example, one of the ways that I always thought, you know, we could do is to go for a contractual alliance with the United States. And I know some people think that this will make Israel more, you know, aggressive. I think the opposite. I think it will make Israel less defensive, and it will also force the United States to look for more diplomacy and for more peaceful arrangements. So I think that's one way to keep the US in the Middle East. Another way is, you know, during the Obama administration, Secretary Kerry asked General Allen to create a plan of how to keep the security of Israel in a two-state solution situation, and it was based on American forces and technology, which the Israeli instinct is not to do that, but I think that could keep the Americans in the region, which is good for us. What we also need is to learn how to live without the Americans and to create those partnerships, just like the UAE and probably with Egypt and Jordan, to find a way to work together against the forces of whether it's the fundamental Shiite in Iran or the fundamental Sunnis from Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So it will force us to cooperate much more with our neighbors, which is, I guess, a good thing. But I still would like to see more of American involvement in the Middle East. More diplomacy than hard power. But, you know, for example, when Obama decided to avoid his red line and to with the Russian to take the chemical weapons out of Syria, of course, it was not successful in moving all the chemical weapons, but it did change the situation in Israel, where we don't produce and distribute gas masks anymore to our population. So that's a big change, even though, unfortunately, Obama doesn't get any credit for that.
Yeah, okay, so thanks for that, Mr. Asif. The last question of our discussion to be addressed to you. How do you assess, tell us the three main factors that metamorphose the relationships between Pakistan and United States?
Well, I think the foremost being that Pakistan geography, traditionally, whether when it was in former Soviet Union or it is now United States dealing with Afghanistan, because geographically Pakistan lies between two nuclear powers, China and India, and then also it is a neighbor to the Middle East. So in that respect, this is very important for the United States. And time and again, whether it was Soviet invasion of Afghanistan or after 9/11, Pakistan geography and Pakistan's importance was there. Secondly, Pakistan-India equation has, in fact, is a serious one, and that can create problems. And third is the US-China rivalry. And in that respect, then Pakistan's relations with China, which are strategic in nature, but with the United States, it's almost transactional. But at the same time, Pakistan has been the bridge between China and the United States in the early 70s when it facilitated the exchange of visits when Henry Kissinger undertook the visit, and that's how United States and China could establish their diplomatic relationship. So in that respect, I think Pakistan has been doing that. And then again, with regard to the Middle East, United States understand that we have been playing a balances role between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is why I think Pakistan's role as a mediator can be appreciated, even though it has not succeeded at the moment in bridging gap between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Still, it is only Pakistan on which the two countries are going to rely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I guess this is it. We did a great job. So thanks to you, thanks to our wonderful speakers, thanks to all of the our followers following us in Zoom, in Facebook, in Instagram, whatever. It was a great honor for me to be the moderator of such a nice discussion. Thanks to our informational Ukrainian partners, Ukrainian radio and Informatsky radio, which will transmit the ideas that you said today to Ukrainian media in order to get Ukrainians acquainted of what do we think about the world architecture. We did a great job. I am honored to have you today and to be the moderator of this discussion. And I guess it won't be our last times that we see each other. We should definitely proceed to this international spirit about which we're talking today. So thanks of all. I guess it's it. So we're free to leave. The video will be available in our Facebook page if you wanted to share on your page, on the page of your institutions. If what, I'm also open to be contacted. So thanks for all, and thanks for being with me today. So I guess it's it. And now I'll end the recording.